in the back of our minds when we think about a great theory like Pierre Bourdieu's is how applicable is it? We see from the Kahn book that he finds there's some deep applicability as long as you start to kind of put the concepts into the context that you're observing as a sociologist. So part of the idea of theory, which a lot of this class has been about, is to help us, give us tools to think about new context. So in the late 1980s, early 1990s, a sociologist by the name of Michèle Lamont, she's from Quebec, so she's bilingual, French and English, wanted to test Bourdieu's ideas about cultural capital at that point in time to see how did it apply to the United States. And how did these ideas apply if we compared them between the United States and France? So she had this pretty ingenious idea that she was going to look right at the group that you would think, from thinking through Pierre Bourdieu, that would have both economic and cultural capital and use it as a way to accrue status and resources and power in their lives. So she interviewed about 150, I think, white middle-class men in both France and the United States. She picked major cities in France, one in France and one in the United States, and then minor cities, so kind of small regional cities, kind of Midwestern city, one in the United States and one in France. And one important thing she does right at the beginning is she wants to say that, you know, while Bourdieu's ideas are really neat, maybe this whole idea of kind of accruing capital isn't quite right. Is it really possible that you can accrue? Now, you can accrue economic capital, or in Pierre Bourdieu's thinking, if you think of cultural capital as having more kind of elite taste based on like music and food and stuff, you could accrue that in terms of gain more of it. But maybe there's other aspects by which distinctions are made in social life that you can't accrue. For example, maybe there are moral boundaries in life. We would say you might not be able to accrue moral status in terms of having lots of it. It may just be that you either kind of have it or not. That people either read you having a certain moral status, or you lose that and don't have that status. So she employs this idea of boundaries to get at the crux of Bourdieu's idea, which is that a lot of social life, particular cultural processes, is about creating divisions, creating distinctions. Now, this isn't a totally new idea in our course. As you remember from the Durkheim unit, we talked a lot about sacred and profane and making classifications. But Lamont, by using this idea of boundaries, gives us a way to think about main dimensions within modern social life that distinction happens, and how this can shift in different social contexts, and how in any time period or country or society we need to look at what the actual boundaries are that are at work at that time. So she has some conclusions for us about what three different types of boundaries looked like in the United States in the early 1990s. One of the things she found right out of the gate is, as opposed to Bourdieu's ideas about cultural capital, which she now calls cultural boundaries, they don't operate so much for Americans. So she basically says this isn't really too much of general middle-class American social life. She says there really isn't the kind of highly developed elite taste that Bourdieu talked about in France. She notes that there's some kind of anti-intellectualism or anti-snobbery in the United States, but that what people in the United States kind of value culturally, or what middle-class white men at least in the United States value culturally, and as a coda here I should say, there's all sorts of problems with this idea of focusing on middle-class white men. But Lamont's argument is she wants to look at the most comparable case to what Bourdieu's idea was about in terms of these middle-class men in France. So that's a coda. But what she finds is that instead of looking at like kind of elite tastes, instead, oftentimes this cultural idea in the United States gets translated to kind of looking at self-actualization behaviors. So she notes that Americans seem to be really impressed and draw boundaries around behaviors of kind of brilliance or kind of or creativity, which is very different than boundaries about elite taste and the correct taste in France, at least what Bourdieu argued. Then she says, in America, we have to actually bring in a new boundary, which Bourdieu certainly didn't talk about, and that's this moral boundary. And she says that this is actually quite strong in the United States, and that one reason Bourdieu might have missed this is because by the end of the 20th century, France was a highly secularized society, at some level kind of open in terms of gender relations and sexual relations, and so may not have had the same sort of background, long cultural history that the United States has. Whereas in the United States, moral boundaries seem to be really important. So Americans have will draw strong boundaries around certain personal characteristics. For example, around sexual dishonesty, around people that seem to be phony or seem to be social climbers or brown nosers, people that seem to be lazy, or people that don't have competence in what they do in life. So she argues that this kind of moral distinction process in the interviews that she would have with these white middle-class men, she picked up on a lot that that's how they judged and made distinctions. So for her, she points out that, hey, this is a real important boundary that doesn't just name reality, that someone is or is not moral, but names certain ways of being as good or bad, and hence can deploy those in kind of distinction contests in different social contexts. Now, just in case you're not convinced that this rather somewhat uniquely aspect of American social life, all you have to do is turn on ESPN and look at the latest college football scandal. A coach in his early 50s, married man, 4 children, Bobby Petrino, who it was having some inappropriate dalliance with a younger woman who was herself engaged and who recently had become an employee of his. Now, we don't know all the facts on this yet, but these things oftentimes catch American attention to the strange puzzlement of Europeans, partly because of this strong moral boundary as a way of making distinctions in American life. Finally, she points out that in the United States, social and socio-economic boundaries, which is a little bit like Bourdieu's idea of economic capital, they're present, but they work a little bit differently in that it's not just about kind of total amounts of accruing economic capital, but behaviors that signal success or signal money, but not in a necessarily over-the-top Hollywood type of way. Sorry, I live here. She says that seems to be important to middle-class American men. Now, looking at this as a whole, what we see is that this idea of boundaries helps us to think about how these patterns of distinction and creating difference, both in kind of the material aspects of life, economics, as well as in other aspects of life, cultural and moral, can be very different in different societies. Now, this isn't too surprising to us. If you remember, we opened the course with these kind of as comparative reading to show how social or cultural systems could be structured quite differently in different geographic societies. But she gives us some new tools by how to think about that, particularly in advanced economies like ours. And she also points out some problems with Pierre Bourdieu when she does this. For example, she notes that these boundaries might be kind of permeable. In other words, they may change, or people may be able to cross them. They may be able to change their status on which side of these boundaries over time. They may not be so immediate. In other words, they may have kind of national or broader patterns to them. I mentioned this example of kind of the moral boundaries of the United States versus them not being a boundary that's important in France. That's not to say people aren't moral, but as a mode of distinction between people, she argues that that moral boundary around character or goodness is not so important in France. But we can see in the United States, in the national broader context, we have a very society where there's a lot of public religiosity. We have a long, deep history at the founding, at least amongst the Puritan part of the founding of the United States, of kind of purity around sexuality and matters of sex. And we also see a strong mythology or ideology in this country about social mobility. that is due to, or that we're kind of a society of kind of openness where anybody could rise. Of course, we usually don't talk about anybody falling, which is quite the case. But this idea that kind of anybody can rise just through sheer kind of internal effort. So she points out that these somewhat almost general ideas that Bourdieu has about how cultural capital must work, actually, if we think about them in terms of boundaries, we see that distinction can operate a little differently. All right, let me take a quick break. I'll come back and I'll do the last segment of this lecture.